Welcome to Alexandria, the great city founded by Alexander the Great on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, which by the 3rd century BCE has become the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the most magnificent library ever assembled, where scholars from across the known world gather to study, debate, and advance human knowledge. For the next few hours, we will explore the Library of Alexandria, not through the legend of its dramatic destruction, but through the quieter, truer story of its daily operations, its remarkable scholars, its vast collections, and its gradual decline across centuries. If you enjoy these calm, thorough explorations of ancient institutions and intellectual history, please like and subscribe to support our channel. It is early morning in the year 235 BCE, during the reign of Ptolemy III Euergetes, and we begin our day not in the library building itself, but in the larger complex of which it was part. The Mauseon, or Temple of the Muses, a research institution that combined elements of what we would call a university, a research institute, a museum, and a religious sanctuary. The Mauseon occupies a substantial area within the royal quarter of Alexandria, near the palace complex of the Ptolemaic kings who founded and funded it. The buildings are magnificent, constructed of white limestone and marble, with colonnaded walkways, spacious lecture halls, reading rooms filled with natural light, private study chambers for senior scholars, gardens where philosophers walk while discussing ideas, and dining halls where intellectual conversation continues over meals. Within this complex works a scholar named Demetrius of Byzantium, a mathematician and astronomer in his early 40s who has been resident at the Mauseon for 15 years. Demetrius is not one of the famous names that history remembers, not an Euclid or an Eratosthenes or an Archimedes, but rather one of the many competent, dedicated scholars who form the intellectual workforce of the institution, teaching students, copying manuscripts, making observations, contributing to the steady accumulation of knowledge that defines Hellenistic scholarship. Demetrius rises before dawn in his small but comfortable apartment within the Mauseon complex. These apartments are provided to resident scholars along with stipends for food and basic needs, freeing them from the necessity of earning a living through other work and allowing them to devote themselves entirely to scholarship. This is one of the revolutionary innovations of the Mauseon, the creation of a class of professional intellectuals paid by the state to think and study and teach. After a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and watered wine, Demetrius makes his way through the pre-dawn darkness to the astronomical observatory, a tower structure equipped with instruments for observing and measuring celestial phenomena. He is continuing a project that has occupied him for several years, creating detailed records of planetary positions to test and refine the mathematical models that astronomers use to predict celestial movements. The work requires precise observation and meticulous record-keeping. Demetrius uses an armillary sphere, a skeletal celestial globe made of metal rings representing the celestial equator, the ecliptic, and other reference circles, along with a dioptra for measuring angular positions. These instruments are sophisticated, but not yet as precise as they will become in later centuries, and much of the astronomer's skill lies in making careful observations and using mathematical techniques to extract reliable data from imperfect measurements. As the sky lightens and the stars fade, Demetrius records his final observations of the morning, notes them on a wax tablet for later transcription to papyrus, and descends from the observatory. The day's real work is about to begin, not observation but teaching, discussion, and the scholarly tasks that consume most of his time. He makes his way to the main library building, a magnificent structure that houses the vast collection of scrolls that has made Alexandria famous throughout the Mediterranean world. The building is designed for both storage and scholarship. Rows of compartmented shelves holding thousands of papyrus scrolls, arranged by subject and catalogued according to a sophisticated system developed by earlier librarians, with reading rooms where scholars can request scrolls and study them under good natural light. The library is not yet open to casual visitors. It will be another hour before students and visiting scholars can enter, but the librarians and senior scholars have access at all hours. Demetrius nods to the guard at the entrance, a Macedonian veteran who has held this position for a decade and who knows by sight all the authorized scholars. Inside, the library is a temple to knowledge. The morning light streams through high windows, illuminating the reading room, where rows of tables stand ready for the day's scholars. The air smells of papyrus and ink, of the slight mustiness that accumulates where thousands of scrolls are stored, of the cedar oil used to preserve the papyrus against insects and decay. The head librarian is already at work, a man named Apollonius of Rhodes, a distinguished poet and scholar who holds one of the most prestigious intellectual positions in the ancient world. Apollonius is reviewing a shipment of scrolls that arrived yesterday from Athens, copies of philosophical works that the library did not previously possess, purchased at considerable expense by agents working for the Ptolemaic court. The Ptolemies have made it their mission to collect all the knowledge of the world, and they pursue this goal with systematic determination and unlimited funding. Agents are stationed in major cities across the Mediterranean, with instructions to purchase or copy any text the library does not already possess. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbour are searched, and any books found aboard are confiscated, copied by the library's scribes, and theoretically returned to their owners, though sometimes the owners receive the copies while the library keeps the originals. This aggressive acquisition policy, combined with over a century of systematic collection, has made the library the largest repository of written knowledge in the ancient world. Estimates of the collection's size vary wildly. Some ancient sources claim hundreds of thousands of scrolls, others claim as many as 700,000, but even the conservative estimates suggest a collection vastly larger than any other library of the era. Demetrius approaches Apollonius with a request. He needs to consult several mathematical texts for his astronomical work, works by earlier scholars whose planetary models he is attempting to verify and improve. Apollonius listens, nods, and summons one of the assistant librarians, a young scholar named Nicanor, who has memorized the cataloguing system and can locate scrolls with remarkable speed. The cataloguing system itself is a marvel of organization. Each scroll has a tag attached, specifying the title, author, subject classification, and storage location. The library maintains a comprehensive catalogue, the Pinakes, compiled by the great scholar Callimachus decades earlier, that lists all holdings organized by subject and by author, with biographical information about authors and critical notes about different versions of texts. This cataloguing system allows a scholar to locate specific works among hundreds of thousands of scrolls, to identify all works by a particular author or on a particular subject, to trace the relationships between different texts and traditions. It is one of the library's greatest achievements, making the vast collection actually usable rather than merely impressive. Nicanor returns after several minutes carrying an armful of scrolls, works by Eudoxus, Apollonius of Perga, and earlier Babylonian astronomical texts that have been translated into Greek. Demetrius takes the scrolls to a reading table, carefully unrolls one, and begins to study, making notes on his wax tablet as he reads. The scrolls are beautiful objects in their own right. The papyrus is of high quality, manufactured in Egypt from papyrus plants grown in the Nile Delta. The text is written in clear, professional hands by trained scribes, the Greek letters formed with practiced precision. Some scrolls include diagrams and illustrations, carefully drawn to supplement the text. But papyrus is also fragile and impermanent. The scrolls must be handled carefully to avoid tearing. They deteriorate over time, becoming brittle and discolored, requiring periodic copying to preserve their contents. Insects and moisture are constant threats, despite the library's use of cedar oil and its careful climate control. The library employs a staff of scribes, whose primary task is creating new copies of deteriorating scrolls, a continuous battle against the entropy that threatens all written knowledge. As Demetrius studies, the library begins to fill with other scholars. Some are permanent residents of the Mausion, like himself. Others are visiting scholars from other cities, granted temporary access to the collection to pursue specific research. Still others are students, advanced pupils studying under the supervision of senior scholars, learning through direct engagement with primary texts, and through participation in the intellectual discussions that are central to Hellenistic education. The atmosphere is quiet, but not silent. Scholars read aloud softly to themselves. Silent reading is uncommon in this era, and most people vocalize at least slightly when reading. The sound is a gentle murmur of voices, an auditory backdrop to intellectual work. Occasionally, someone asks a question of a nearby scholar, and quiet conversations develop, debates about interpretation or references or the reliability of different textual versions. Near midday, Demetrius attends a lecture by Eratosthenes, the current head of the library and one of the most brilliant scholars of the age. Eratosthenes is a polymath, mathematician, geographer, poet, athlete, and his lectures range across multiple disciplines, demonstrating the interconnections between different fields of knowledge. Today's lecture concerns a famous calculation Eratosthenes has recently completed, an estimate of the Earth's circumference using geometric reasoning and careful measurement. He explains how he learned that in Cyene, modern Aswan, far to the south, the sun at noon on the summer solstice shines directly down a well, indicating it is directly overhead. On the same day in Alexandria, the sun is not quite overhead, but casts a shadow, indicating it is about 7 degrees from the vertical. Using this angular measurement, and knowing the distance between Alexandria and Cyene, approximately 5,000 stadia, based on reports from travelers, Eratosthenes applies geometric reasoning. If 7 degrees represents the distance between the two cities, then the full circle of 360 degrees represents the Earth's full circumference. The calculation yields approximately 250,000 stadia, or roughly 40,000 kilometers, remarkably close to the true value of approximately 40,075 kilometers. The lecture is a demonstration of the Hellenistic scientific method: careful observation, geometric reasoning, measurement, calculation. The scholars listening ask penetrating questions about the accuracy of the measurements, about assumptions built into the calculation, about alternative methods that might be used to verify the result. This questioning, this critical engagement with ideas, is central to the intellectual culture of the Mausion. After the lecture, scholars gather in small groups to continue the discussion. Demetrius joins a conversation with several mathematicians who are debating the geometric principles Eratosthenes used. The debate is vigorous but courteous, with scholars citing previous authorities, specifically proposing alternative approaches, refining arguments through dialectical exchange. This is the daily rhythm of life in the Mausion. Individual study in the library, lectures by senior scholars, informal discussions and debates, the continuous examination and advancement of knowledge through collective intellectual effort. It is a rhythm that has continued for generations and that will continue for centuries to come, making Alexandria the intellectual heart of the Hellenistic world. As afternoon approaches, Demetrius returns to his apartment to prepare for his own teaching duties. He will spend the late afternoon lecturing to a small group of advanced students on mathematical astronomy, guiding them through the geometric models used to predict planetary positions, assigning them calculation exercises, training the next generation of scholars who will carry forward the tradition. The work is demanding but deeply satisfying. Demetrius knows he is part of something larger than himself, a community of scholars, stretching back generations and forward into an indefinite future, dedicated to preserving and advancing human understanding. The library and the Mausion make this work possible, providing the resources, the community, the institutional support that allows intellectual life to flourish. As he gathers his teaching materials, Demetrius reflects on his good fortune. In most of the ancient world, learning is the privilege of the wealthy who can afford private tutors, or it is the domain of isolated individuals working alone. But here in Alexandria, the Ptolemies have created something unprecedented, an institution dedicated to scholarship, adequately funded, staffed with brilliant minds, equipped with the world's greatest collection of texts. It is an intellectual paradise, and Demetrius knows it, knows how privileged he is to be part of it, knows how fragile such institutions are, and how fortunate that this one has endured for over 50 years and shows every sign of continuing indefinitely. But institutions, however magnificent, are human creations, and they are subject to the same forces of change and decay that affect all human endeavors. The story of the Library of Alexandria is not just the story of its golden age, but also the story of how it persisted, adapted, and ultimately declined across the centuries that followed. Let us now move forward approximately 2.5 centuries to the year 30 BCE, a transformative moment in the library's history. Egypt has just been conquered by Rome. Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers, is dead by her own hand. Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, has annexed Egypt as his personal province. The Ptolemaic dynasty that founded and patronized the library for nearly 300 years has ended. For the scholars of the Mausian, this transition is fraught with uncertainty. The Ptolemies were Greek rulers who valued Greek learning and made the library and the Mausian central to their claims of cultural superiority and legitimacy. Will the new Roman masters continue this patronage? Or will they regard the institution as an expensive vanity, a luxury that can be reduced or eliminated? A scholar named Marcus Verrius Flaccus stands in the main reading room of the library, which has survived the recent turmoil but bears subtle scars. Some scrolls were damaged or destroyed during the fighting that accompanied the Roman conquest. There are gaps in the collection where valuable texts once stood. But the basic structure of the institution has survived, and scholars like Marcus are cautiously optimistic that it will continue. Marcus is himself a symbol of the changing times. He is Roman, not Greek, though he is thoroughly educated in Greek learning. All educated Romans of this era are. He has been sent to Alexandria by Augustus himself, tasked with cataloguing the library's holdings and reporting on its condition and value. His report will help determine the institution's future under Roman rule. As Marcus examines the collection, he is both impressed and troubled. The number of scrolls is staggering. He estimates perhaps 400,000 in the main library, with perhaps another 40,000 in the subsidiary library attached to the Temple of Serapis. The range of subjects is comprehensive: literature, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, geography, grammar, rhetoric, every field of Greek learning. But he also notices problems. Many scrolls are old and deteriorating. The cataloguing system, while sophisticated, has not been maintained consistently in recent decades. There are duplicates, sometimes multiple copies of the same work filling shelf space that could be used for new acquisitions. Some sections are disorganized, suggesting that the careful curation of earlier eras has lapsed. More troubling is what Marcus learns from conversations with the remaining scholars. The Mausians' funding has been declining for decades. The later Ptolemies, preoccupied with political struggles and lacking the resources of their predecessors, reduced the stipends paid to scholars and cut back on acquisition budgets. Some of the greatest scholars of the previous generation left Alexandria for other centers of learning: Rhodes, Pergamum, Athens, where conditions were more favorable. The institution has been coasting on its accumulated reputation and resources, but it has not been thriving. The glory days of Eratosthenes and Apollonius are past. The current generation of scholars is competent, but not brilliant. New ideas are more likely to emerge in Rome or Athens than in Alexandria. Marcus's report to Augustus is balanced. He notes the problems, but argues for the library's continued value. Rome, he writes, has conquered the Greek world militarily. But Rome has always acknowledged Greek cultural and intellectual superiority. Supporting the Library of Alexandria would demonstrate Roman commitment to learning, would help Romanize the institution while preserving its treasures, would provide Roman scholars access to knowledge that exists nowhere else. Augustus, to his credit, accepts this argument. He orders that the library be maintained, that funding be continued at levels sufficient to preserve the collection and support basic operations. He does not restore the generous patronage of the early Ptolemies, but he prevents the institution's collapse. The library and Mausian will continue, now as Roman rather than Ptolemaic institutions, their mission essentially unchanged, but their context fundamentally transformed. The decades that follow see a gradual Romanization of the institution. More Roman scholars arrive, some appointed to positions that were traditionally held by Greeks. Latin texts begin to appear in the collection alongside Greek works, though Greek remains the dominant language of scholarship. The library becomes one node in a larger network of Roman libraries. the great libraries being established in Rome itself, the collections in other major cities, the private libraries of wealthy Romans. In some ways, Roman rule brings benefits. The library gains access to Latin works that were not available under the Ptolemies. Roman engineering expertise is applied to improving the library buildings, adding better climate control, creating more efficient storage systems. The Roman administrative system brings a certain professional competence to the library's operations, replacing the sometimes haphazard Ptolemaic management. But something is also lost. The library is no longer the unique jewel of a dynasty that defined itself through cultural patronage. It is now one institution among many in a vast empire, valued but not central to imperial identity. The sense of mission that animated the early librarians, the drive to collect all the world's knowledge, to make Alexandria the intellectual capital of the world, gives way to a more modest goal of maintaining what exists and serving the scholarly community. Let us visit the library again, now in the year 100 CE, during the reign of Trajan. The institution has stabilized under Roman rule. It is well funded, professionally managed, actively used by scholars from across the empire. But it is also changing in subtle ways that will have long-term consequences. A scholar named Julia Balbilla, a rare example of a female intellectual in this era, possible because of her aristocratic status and exceptional education, is conducting research in the library. She is working on a literary project, poetry about her travels with the imperial court, but she also has antiquarian interests and has been studying the library's oldest scrolls, some of which date back to the institution's founding. What Julia notices is that the collection is slowly shifting in character. The oldest scrolls, from the Ptolemaic era, are deteriorating. Some have been copied, but copying is expensive and selective. The librarians prioritize texts that are actively used, works by famous authors, standard texts used in education, references that scholars consult regularly. Less popular works, texts by obscure authors, older versions of works that exist in newer editions, these are copied less frequently or not at all. When the original papyrus deteriorates beyond readability, the text is effectively lost, even though it may still be listed in the catalogue. The collection is not static, but dynamic, constantly renewed through copying, but also constantly diminished through loss of texts that are not deemed worth the expense of preservation. Julia discusses this with the current head librarian, a scholar named Tiberius Claudius Balbillus. He acknowledges the problem, but explains the constraints. "We must be selective," he says. "Papyrus is expensive, skilled scribes are expensive. We cannot copy everything. We preserve what is most valuable, what scholars actually use. The alternative would be to preserve nothing, to let the entire collection deteriorate." This is the beginning of a gradual narrowing of the collection. Works that would fascinate later historians and philologists, variant versions of texts, commentaries by lesser-known scholars, experimental works that were not widely appreciated in their time, disappear, their papyrus crumbling to dust, their contents lost, except for occasional references in other works that survive. The library is also facing a new kind of competition, Christianity. By the 2nd century CE, Alexandria has become one of the major centers of Christian learning. Christian scholars are creating their own libraries, copying their own texts, developing their own intellectual traditions. Some of these scholars have access to the main library and use it for their research, but others regard it as a pagan institution, associated with the old gods and the old learning that Christianity is displacing. The great Christian scholar Origen, working in Alexandria in the early 3rd century, exemplifies this complex relationship. He uses the library extensively for his biblical scholarship, consulting Greek translations of Hebrew scriptures, comparing different textual versions, drawing on the philological expertise that Alexandrian scholars have developed over centuries. But Origen also recognizes that the library's mission and Christianity's mission are potentially in conflict. The library seeks to preserve all knowledge, including works by pagan philosophers who deny Christian truths, medical texts that discuss practices Christians consider immoral, literary works that celebrate pagan gods and values. As Christianity grows stronger, as it moves toward becoming the dominant religion of the empire, this inclusiveness becomes increasingly problematic. For now, the tension is manageable. The library continues to operate, continues to serve scholars of all persuasions, continues to maintain its comprehensive collection. But the seeds of future conflict have been planted, and they will grow in the centuries to come. Another challenge facing the library is the gradual shift in textual technology. In the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the codex, a book with pages bound together, essentially the form that books still take today, begins to replace the scroll as the preferred format for texts. Codices have several advantages. They are more compact, easier to navigate, you can flip to a specific page rather than unrolling an entire scroll, and more durable. Christian texts are among the first to adopt the codex format widely, perhaps because early Christian communities found it more practical for liturgical use. But gradually, pagan texts also begin to appear in codex form. This creates a dilemma for the library. The collection is almost entirely in scroll format, the product of centuries of copying and accumulation. Converting the collection to codices would be enormously expensive, requiring the recopying of hundreds of thousands of texts. The library takes a middle path. New acquisitions are increasingly in codex form, and when important scrolls need to be recopied, they are sometimes copied as codices rather than as scrolls. But the bulk of the collection remains in scroll format, gradually becoming old-fashioned, increasingly difficult to use as scholars become more accustomed to codices. This technological transition, like the narrowing of the collection through selective copying, represents a subtle form of loss. The library's holdings become less accessible, less relevant to contemporary scholarly practice. New libraries being established in Constantinople and other cities start with codex collections, giving them advantages of convenience and modernity that Alexandria cannot match without massive investment. Yet despite these challenges, the library persists through the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. It remains one of the great libraries of the Roman world. Scholars continue to visit, to study, to make discoveries. The institution adapts to changing conditions, maintains its core mission of preserving and providing access to knowledge, continues to contribute to intellectual life. But the golden age is past. The library is no longer driving intellectual innovation, no longer attracting the most brilliant minds, no longer expanding and improving at the rate it once did. It has entered a long plateau, a period of stable but slowly declining relevance that will characterize the next several centuries of its existence. To understand the library's slow decline, we must understand its daily operations, the unglamorous but essential work of maintaining a massive collection of fragile texts, the administrative and financial structures that supported this work, and the ways these structures became increasingly inadequate over time. Let us visit the library in the year 270 CE, during a period of crisis for the Roman Empire. Civil wars, economic instability, and military threats on multiple frontiers are straining imperial resources. Alexandria itself has recently experienced violence during political upheavals, and the library has suffered some damage, though nothing catastrophic. The head librarian is a man named Theon, not to be confused with the more famous Theon, who will live a century later. This Theon is a capable administrator who spends most of his time not on scholarship, but on the practical problems of keeping the library functioning in difficult times. His primary challenge is financial. The library's budget comes from imperial funds, allocated by the provincial governor of Egypt. But with the empire in crisis, funds are being diverted to military needs, and the library's allocation has been reduced. Theon must make difficult choices about what to prioritize. Copying scrolls is the largest single expense. The library employs approximately 30 full-time scribes, skilled workers who can produce clear, accurate copies of texts. Each scribe can copy perhaps one scroll per week, depending on the length and complexity of the text. This means the library can produce approximately 1,500 new scrolls per year, barely enough to replace deteriorating scrolls from the existing collection, leaving little capacity for copying new acquisitions or creating backup copies of important works. Theon would like to employ more scribes to accelerate the copying process, to create multiple backup copies of the most important texts. But he cannot afford it. The scribes must be paid competitive wages to retain their skills, and wages have been inflating due to the empire's economic problems. Hiring more scribes would require budget increases that are not forthcoming. He also faces costs for materials. Papyrus must be purchased from Egyptian manufacturers. Ink must be prepared from soot and gum. Cedar oil must be obtained for preserving scrolls against insects. All these costs are rising, consuming an increasing share of the library's shrinking budget. Then there are building maintenance costs. The library buildings are over 500 years old. They require constant repairs. Roof tiles replaced, walls repointed, wooden shelving treated against decay, climate control systems maintained. Defer these repairs, and the collection suffers as moisture and insects penetrate the storage areas. But maintenance competes with copying for the limited budget. Theon sits in his office, reviewing accounts, making calculations, trying to balance competing needs with insufficient resources. He decides to reduce the number of scribes from 30 to 25, to defer some building maintenance, to be more selective about which scrolls are copied. These are rational decisions given his constraints, but they represent a slow retreat, a gradual reduction in the library's capacity to preserve its own collection. The library's administrative structure has also become more complex and bureaucratic over time. Under the Ptolemies, the head librarian had substantial autonomy and could make decisions about acquisitions, copying priorities, and collection development based on scholarly judgment. Under Roman rule, the library is embedded in the provincial administration, and the head librarian must navigate bureaucratic requirements, submit budgets for approval, justify expenditures to officials who may not understand or care about scholarly needs. Theon spends considerable time on correspondence with the provincial governor's office, explaining why the library needs its full budget allocation, arguing that reducing funding would damage a cultural treasure, providing lists and reports and justifications. It is tedious work, far removed from scholarship, but it is necessary for the library's survival. He also manages the library's staff, not just the scribes, but also the assistant librarians who help scholars locate scrolls, the guards who provide security, the maintenance workers who clean and repair the buildings, the cataloguers who maintain the records of holdings. This is a substantial organization, employing perhaps 80 people, all of whom must be supervised, paid, and coordinated. The assistant librarians are particularly important to the library's functioning. These are junior scholars, usually young men who have completed their basic education and are working at the library while pursuing advanced studies. They learn the cataloging system, memorize the locations of frequently requested works, develop expertise in particular subject areas. They are the interface between scholars and the collection, the people who make the library's vast holdings actually accessible. One such assistant librarian is a young man named Marcus Aurelius Ammonius, no relation to the emperor. Marcus has been working at the library for 2 years, and he has become expert in the philosophical section of the collection. When a scholar requests a work by Plato or Aristotle or the Stoics, Marcus knows exactly where to find it, can retrieve it quickly, can often suggest related works that might be useful. This expertise is acquired through experience, not through formal training. New assistant librarians learn from senior colleagues, gradually mastering the complex geography of the collection. It is knowledge that exists in human memory and practice rather than in written form, and it is vulnerable to loss if experienced staff leave and are not adequately replaced. Marcus earns a modest salary, enough to live on, but not generous. The position is valuable because it provides access to the collection for his own studies, and because it is a pathway to higher positions. Former assistant librarians sometimes become senior scholars or are appointed to teaching positions elsewhere. But the pay is low enough that many talented young scholars prefer other opportunities, and the library sometimes struggles to attract and retain the best people. The scholars who use the library have also changed over the centuries. In the Ptolemaic era, most users were resident members of the Mausion, full-time scholars supported by royal patronage. Now, most users are visitors, teachers from Alexandria's various schools, students working on advanced studies, scholars from other cities who visit Alexandria specifically to consult texts not available elsewhere, educated gentlemen pursuing private research. The library has become more of a reference library, less of a research institute. The community of full-time resident scholars has shrunk as funding for such positions has declined. The intellectual conversations that once filled the museum's halls now happen elsewhere, in private homes, in philosophical schools scattered across the city, in Christian institutions that are developing their own scholarly traditions. Theon sometimes reflects on this change with regret. He has read descriptions of the library's golden age, knows stories of the great scholars who worked here, understands that the institution has declined from its peak. But he also takes pride in what the library still accomplishes. It preserves texts that would otherwise be lost. It serves scholars who need access to knowledge. It maintains continuity with the great tradition of Hellenistic learning. On a typical day, perhaps 20 to 30 scholars use the library. Some are regulars who visit daily or several times per week. Others are occasional users who come for specific research needs. They request scrolls from the assistant librarians, study them in the reading rooms, sometimes make their own copies if they need to take material away. The library has rules about borrowing. In general, scrolls cannot be removed from the building. They are too valuable and fragile, and the risk of loss or damage is too great. Exceptions are made for the most distinguished scholars and for certain purposes, but even then, the borrower must provide some form of security, a deposit of money or a guarantee from a wealthy patron, to ensure the scroll's return. These precautions have not prevented all losses. Over the centuries, some scrolls have been stolen, others borrowed and never returned. The library maintains records of missing texts, and sometimes scrolls are recovered when they turn up in private collections or other libraries. But many losses are permanent. Texts that existed in the library's catalogue, but no longer exist in its collection. Theon also deals with requests from other libraries for copies of Alexandria's holdings. This is a recent development. In earlier centuries, Alexandria's collection was so superior to all others that requests flowed primarily toward Alexandria. Now, other libraries have grown larger and more sophisticated, and sometimes they have texts that Alexandria lacks. The library engages in exchanges, copying texts for other institutions in return for receiving copies of texts it needs. This shift from accumulation to exchange represents another subtle transformation. The library is no longer growing significantly, no longer acquiring new texts at the rate it once did. It is maintaining its collection, replacing what is lost, filling gaps, but not expanding dramatically. The mission has shifted from universal collection to selective preservation, from being the world's library to being one important library among several. As the afternoon wanes and scholars begin to depart, Theon makes his rounds of the library, checking that scrolls have been properly returned to their locations, that the reading rooms are secured, that everything is ready for the next day. It is routine work, but it is important. The library functions because of these routines, because of the daily diligence of staff who care for the collection, because of systems and procedures built up over centuries. Walking through the stacks, Theon passes shelf after shelf of scrolls, the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world, texts by authors famous and obscure, copies that may be the only ones that exist, works that have been preserved through the library's efforts and that will be lost if the library fails. He feels the weight of responsibility. This collection is his charge, his to preserve and pass on to his successor, who will pass it on in turn. The chain of stewardship stretches back to the library's founding and must stretch forward into an indefinite future. Maintaining that chain, ensuring the collection's survival, is the central purpose of his work. But he also knows how fragile it all is. The buildings could burn. Political violence could destroy the collection. Funding could be cut to levels that make operation impossible. The empire itself could collapse, taking the library down with it. These are not idle fears. He has seen violence in Alexandria during his lifetime, has seen other institutions destroyed, knows that nothing lasts forever. For now, the library survives. The work continues. Tomorrow will bring another day of scholars and scrolls, of preservation and study, of the slow, essential work of maintaining continuity with the past and transmitting knowledge to the future. That is enough. That must be enough. The 4th century CE brings profound changes to the Roman Empire and to Alexandria. Constantine's conversion and the subsequent establishment of Christianity as the empire's favoured religion fundamentally alter the context in which the library operates. What was once an empire of many religions, where pagan, Jewish, and Christian learning could coexist with relative tolerance, becomes increasingly Christian in its institutions and values. Let us visit Alexandria in the year 391 CE, a crucial moment in the library's history. The Emperor Theodosius I has recently issued edicts forbidding pagan worship and ordering the closure of pagan temples. In Alexandria, the Christian patriarch Theophilus, with support from the imperial governor, is leading a campaign to destroy pagan sanctuaries and assert Christian dominance over the city. The main target is the Temple of Serapis, one of the grandest pagan temples in the empire. This temple has an associated library, sometimes called the Daughter Library, that contains approximately 40,000 scrolls, making it one of the largest libraries in the world outside the main Mouseion library. A scholar named Hypatia, the daughter of Theon the mathematician, a different Theon from the one we met earlier, watches with horror as Christian mobs attack the temple complex. Hypatia is herself a pagan, a philosopher and mathematician who teaches in Alexandria, who has access to both the main library and the Serapeum library, who represents the continuation of the ancient tradition of Hellenistic learning. The violence is sudden and brutal. Christian zealots, encouraged by Theophilus and enabled by imperial policy, storm the temple, destroying statues of the gods, desecrating sacred spaces, and, most devastating for the history of knowledge, destroying the library. Scrolls are burned, torn apart, trampled in the chaos. The mob shows no regard for the value of the texts, sees them only as products of pagan culture that must be eliminated. Hypatia tries to intervene, tries to argue that destroying books harms Christianity itself, that Christian scholars use these texts, that knowledge is universal and should not be destroyed regardless of its origins. But the mob is not interested in argument. Some scrolls from the Serapeum are saved, rescued by sympathetic individuals, hidden away, later recovered. But the majority are lost. Centuries of collection and preservation, thousands of unique texts, are destroyed in a few hours of religious violence. This destruction of the Serapeum library represents the single largest documented loss of ancient texts associated with Alexandria. It is not the only destruction the libraries faced. There were other episodes of violence and loss across the centuries, but it is the most clearly attested and the most clearly motivated by religious hostility to pagan learning. The main library of the Mouseion survives this episode, partly because it is more closely associated with the imperial administration and less obviously a pagan religious institution, partly because it has Christian as well as pagan users who value its holdings. But the survival comes at a price. The library must adapt to Christian dominance, must demonstrate its utility to Christian scholarship, must distance itself from association with pagan religion. The decades following the destruction of the Serapeum see a transformation of the library's character. Christian texts, biblical manuscripts, theological treatises, works by church fathers, become an increasingly large proportion of new acquisitions. Pagan philosophical and literary works remain in the collection, but they are no longer actively acquired or promoted. The emphasis shifts toward texts that are compatible with Christian learning. Some scholars argue that this represents not so much a Christian transformation as a slow death, that the library's essential mission, to preserve all knowledge regardless of its origins or religious implications, was incompatible with Christian hegemony, that once that hegemony was established, the library's decline was inevitable. But the situation was more complex than a simple story of Christian destruction would suggest. Many Christian scholars valued the library and used it extensively. The great Christian theologians of Alexandria, Clement, Origen, Athanasius, were educated in Greek philosophy and literature, drew on the library's resources for their work, saw continuity rather than conflict between classical learning and Christian faith. The issue was not Christianity itself, but a particular kind of Christian zealotry that viewed pagan learning as dangerous and corrupting, that wanted to destroy rather than preserve, that valued purity over knowledge. This zealotry was not universal among Christians. Many Christian intellectuals opposed it, but it was powerful enough to cause significant damage. Hypatia herself becomes a victim of this zealotry. In 415 CE, she is murdered by a Christian mob, her body torn apart in one of the most brutal incidents of religious violence in ancient Alexandria. Her murder is motivated partly by religious hostility, she is pagan in a Christian city, and partly by political conflict. She is associated with the prefect Orestes, who is in dispute with the patriarch Cyril. Hypatia's death sends a message to pagan scholars. Alexandria is no longer safe for those who maintain the old traditions. Many leave, taking their expertise and their students elsewhere. The community of scholars that has sustained the library for centuries begins to dissolve, and with it, the library's purpose and vitality diminish. But we must be careful not to oversimplify. The library does not end in 415 CE. It continues to operate for centuries after Hypatia's death. Christian scholars continue to use it. Texts continue to be copied and preserved. The institution adapts, survives, persists, even as its character changes. Let us visit the library once more, now in the year 500 CE. The Roman Empire in the west has collapsed. Italy is ruled by Germanic kings. Rome itself has been sacked multiple times. But in the east, the empire continues, and Alexandria remains one of its great cities. The library is still functioning, though much diminished from its ancient glory. The head librarian is a Christian monk named Eusebius. The library is now fully integrated into Christian Alexandria. Its staff predominantly Christian, its acquisition policy focused on Christian texts and on classical works that are deemed useful for Christian education. The great pagan philosophical works are still in the collection, but they are less frequently requested, and when they deteriorate, they may or may not be copied. Eusebius sees his role as preservation rather than expansion. He is not trying to collect all the world's knowledge, but to preserve the knowledge that exists, to maintain what has been inherited from earlier generations. The mission is more modest, but still important. The collection itself has shrunk significantly. Many scrolls from the Ptolemaic and early Roman periods have deteriorated beyond recovery. The library's reduced budget has meant selective copying, and texts that were not deemed essential have been allowed to disappear. Eusebius estimates the collection now numbers perhaps 150,000 scrolls, still substantial, but a fraction of what it once was. The shift from scrolls to codices is nearly complete. New texts are almost exclusively in codex form, and when old scrolls are copied, they are copied as codices. This makes the library more practical and modern, but it also means that the ancient scroll collection, the tangible link to the Ptolemaic founders, is gradually vanishing. Eusebius is a conscientious administrator. He maintains careful records, manages the staff competently, ensures that copying continues at a rate sufficient to preserve the most important texts. But he is not a visionary. He is not trying to restore the library to its former glory or to chart new directions. He is simply maintaining what exists, keeping the institution alive in difficult times. And the times are difficult. Alexandria faces economic problems as trade patterns shift and the city's prosperity declines. Political instability in the empire creates uncertainty about funding and support. Religious controversies between different Christian factions occasionally spill over into violence. The library survives in this context, but it is a survival characterized by contraction and conservation rather than by growth and innovation. Yet even in this diminished state, the library continues to serve an essential function. Scholars still visit, still request texts, still make discoveries. Teachers still use the collection for education. The library preserves works that would otherwise be lost, maintains continuity with the ancient tradition of learning, provides resources that enable intellectual work, and it continues to copy texts, to create new codices that will outlast the papyrus scrolls from which they are copied, to transmit knowledge to future generations. This work may be less glamorous than the great acquisitions of the Ptolemaic era, but it is equally essential. Without it, much of ancient learning would have disappeared entirely. As Eusebius walks through the library in the evening quiet, after the scholars have departed, he reflects on his responsibilities. He is the steward of a great inheritance, a collection built over centuries, containing knowledge that took generations to accumulate. His task is to pass this inheritance on, to ensure that what he received, he transmits to those who come after. It is a humbler role than the great librarians of the past, those who built the collection and made it the wonder of the ancient world. But it is an honorable role, and Eusebius performs it with diligence and dedication. The library will outlast him, will continue after his death, will persist as long as people value knowledge and are willing to work to preserve it. How much longer that will be, he cannot know. But for now, the work continues, one day at a time, one text at a time, the slow essential labor of preservation and transmission that has sustained the library through centuries of change, and that must continue if the knowledge of the past is to reach the future. The year is 642 CE, and Alexandria is about to change hands once again. The Arab armies of Islam, having conquered Syria and Palestine, are now besieging the great city. After a siege of several months, the city capitulates, and Egypt becomes part of the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. This conquest brings both disruption and continuity to the library. The disruption is immediate. Warfare, even relatively restrained warfare, causes damage to buildings and collections. Some texts are surely lost during the conquest and its aftermath. The change in rulers creates uncertainty about funding and support. The scholars and librarians who have maintained the library wonder what will become of it under the new Islamic rulers. But continuity also asserts itself. The Arab conquerors, unlike some previous conquerors, value learning. Islamic civilization is developing a strong tradition of scholarship, particularly in science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. The new rulers recognize the library's value and are interested in preserving and accessing its holdings. A scholar named John Philoponus, a Christian who has worked at the library for decades, finds himself negotiating with the new Arab authorities about the library's future. Philoponus is a distinguished philosopher and scientist, a commentator on Aristotle, a man whose learning crosses religious boundaries and makes him valuable to the new rulers. The Arabs are particularly interested in scientific and medical texts. They want access to Greek works on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, the practical and theoretical knowledge that will help them govern their new empire and advance their own learning. They are less interested in Greek literature and poetry, which has limited utility from their perspective. Philoponus explains the library's holdings, describes the cataloguing system, offers to help make the collection accessible to Arab scholars. He argues that the library should be preserved as a resource for learning, that its value transcends any particular political or religious allegiance, that knowledge belongs to all humanity. The Arab authorities are receptive to this argument, at least partially. They agree to maintain the library, to continue supporting the basic functions of preservation and access. But they also begin a program of translation, commissioning Arabic versions of Greek scientific texts, gradually building up an Arabic scholarly literature that will eventually rival and surpass the Greek tradition from which it draws. This translation movement represents both preservation and transformation. Many Greek texts survive only because they were translated into Arabic and later retranslated into Latin, eventually finding their way back into European learning during the Renaissance. But the process is selective. Texts that interest Islamic scholars are translated, while others are neglected and eventually lost. The library itself undergoes a slow transformation. Over the following centuries, it becomes more of an Arabic library than a Greek one, with Arabic texts increasingly dominant in the collection, with Islamic scholars as the primary users, with the ancient Greek holdings becoming increasingly marginalized even as they continue to be preserved. A famous but probably apocryphal story about this period claims that the Caliph Umar ordered the library burned, arguing that books that agree with the Quran are unnecessary and books that disagree with it are pernicious. This story, repeated by many later authors, has shaped popular understanding of the library's fate. But modern historians largely reject it as a later fabrication, probably invented by Christian chroniclers to portray the Arab conquerors as destroyers of learning. The actual fate of the library was more gradual and more complex. It was not destroyed in a single dramatic event, but declined slowly over centuries, losing texts through fire and warfare and simple neglect, becoming less central to intellectual life as new centers of learning emerged in Baghdad and Cordoba and elsewhere in the Islamic world. Let us visit the library one final time, in the year 1000 CE, more than 13 centuries after its founding. The institution still exists, though it is a shadow of its former self. The buildings are old and poorly maintained. The collection has shrunk to perhaps 20 or 30,000 texts, mostly in Arabic, with some Greek works that have been deemed valuable enough to preserve. The head librarian is an Arab scholar named Ahmad ibn Muhammad. He presides over an institution that is respected, but no longer central to Islamic learning. The great days when Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the world are long past. The centers of Islamic scholarship are now in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Cordoba. Alexandria is a provincial city, still important, but no longer preeminent. Ahmad knows the library's history, has read accounts of its ancient glory, understands how far it has declined. But he also sees value in what remains. The library still holds texts that exist nowhere else, still serves scholars who visit to consult rare works, still preserves knowledge that would otherwise be lost. The collection includes Greek philosophical works that have been copied and recopied, transmitted across centuries. It includes scientific texts that Islamic scholars study and build upon. It includes historical works that preserve knowledge of the ancient world. Much has been lost, but much has also been preserved, and Ahmad takes pride in the preservation, even as he regrets the losses. The library faces constant challenges. Funding is uncertain, dependent on the priorities of rulers who may or may not value learning. The buildings need repairs that cannot always be afforded. The process of copying texts to replace deteriorating originals is expensive and selective. Ahmad must make constant, difficult choices about what to preserve and what to let go. But the work continues. Scribes copy texts, scholars visit and study. The library maintains its catalogue, trains new assistant librarians, performs the daily routines that keep the institution functioning. It is not glorious work, but it is essential work, the work of preservation that makes the transmission of knowledge possible. The library will continue for several more centuries in this diminished state. It will survive into the medieval period, serving as a resource for scholars, maintaining some continuity with the ancient past. But it will never again be the great library it once was, the institution that gathered all the world's knowledge, the intellectual capital that drew scholars from across the known world. The final end, when it comes, is not a dramatic burning or a violent destruction, but a slow fading away. At some point, the exact date is uncertain and disputed, the library ceases to function as a major institution. Perhaps it is destroyed in one of the many conflicts that afflict medieval Alexandria. Perhaps it is simply abandoned as funding disappears and scholars move elsewhere. Perhaps its holdings are gradually dispersed, sold off, or given away, or simply lost. The historical record becomes murky. Later sources refer to libraries in Alexandria, but it is unclear whether these are continuations of the ancient library or new institutions. The connection to the Ptolemaic foundation becomes tenuous and eventually breaks. The Great Library of Alexandria passes from active institution to legend, from living reality to historical memory. What remains is the knowledge that was transmitted. Some texts copied in Alexandria survive in later copies, transmitted through Byzantine and Islamic channels, eventually reaching medieval European universities and Renaissance humanists. The work of Euclid and Archimedes, of Ptolemy and Galen, of countless other ancient scholars, survives partly because it was once collected and preserved in Alexandria. Other texts are lost, known only through references in surviving works or through titles in ancient catalogues. We know they once existed, know something of their contents from quotations and summaries, but the actual texts are gone, casualties of the slow attrition that affected all ancient libraries. The story of the Library of Alexandria is ultimately a story of preservation and loss, of human effort to gather and maintain knowledge in the face of constant threats, physical decay, political instability, religious conflict, economic constraints, simple human fallibility. The library succeeded for centuries, preserving far more than was lost, transmitting the learning of the ancient world to later civilizations. But it also failed, losing texts that can never be recovered, allowing knowledge to disappear that might have enriched subsequent history. As we reflect on the Library of Alexandria, its scholars, its scrolls, and its slow demise, what lessons can we draw? What does this ancient institution teach us about the preservation of knowledge, the fragility of cultural achievement, the conditions necessary for intellectual life to flourish? First, the library reminds us that preserving knowledge is hard work, requiring constant effort and substantial resources. Knowledge does not preserve itself. Texts deteriorate, buildings decay, institutional memory fades. Maintaining a library, any library, requires copying texts, repairing buildings, training staff, managing resources, generation after generation, century after century. The Library of Alexandria succeeded for as long as it did because successive generations committed to this work. The Ptolemaic kings funded it generously. Roman emperors maintained it adequately. Librarians and scribes performed the daily tasks of preservation. When this commitment faltered, when resources diminished, when priorities shifted, the library declined. This lesson is relevant to modern libraries and archives. The digital age has created new preservation challenges. Digital information is even more fragile than papyrus, requiring constant migration to new formats and platforms to remain accessible. We like to imagine that modern technology has solved the preservation problem, but in fact, it has only changed its form. The work of preservation must continue, must be funded, must be valued, or knowledge will be lost just as surely as ancient scrolls were lost. Second, the library's history illustrates the importance of diversity and tolerance in intellectual life. The library flourished when it welcomed scholars of different backgrounds, when it collected texts representing diverse traditions, when it valued knowledge regardless of its origins. It declined when religious and political conflicts made such openness difficult, when certain kinds of knowledge became suspect, when collections were purged of texts deemed dangerous or impure. The destruction of the Serapeum Library stands as a warning about what happens when zealotry overcomes respect for learning. The texts destroyed in that violence were not dangerous. They were works of philosophy, science, literature, the accumulated intellectual achievement of centuries. Their destruction did not advance Christianity or protect anyone from harm. It simply destroyed knowledge, impoverishing all subsequent generations. This too has modern relevance. Book burnings and library destructions have occurred throughout history and continue to occur in our own time. Authoritarian regimes, religious extremists, and ideological movements of various kinds have all sought to destroy books and suppress knowledge. The Library of Alexandria's history reminds us of what is lost when such efforts succeed. Third, the library demonstrates that intellectual institutions depend on political and economic support, but are vulnerable to changes in that support. The Ptolemies created the library because it served their purposes. It enhanced their prestige, attracted talent to their court, contributed to the glory of their dynasty. When those purposes were no longer served, when new rulers had different priorities, support declined. This dependency is both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because large-scale preservation of knowledge requires resources that only wealthy patrons, whether royal dynasties, governments, or private donors, can provide. Dangerous because it makes intellectual institutions vulnerable to political changes, economic crises, shifts in priorities. The library might have benefited from more diverse funding sources, from endowments that could sustain it, independent of current rulers' whims, from institutional structures that protected it from political interference. But such mechanisms were not well developed in the ancient world, and the library suffered as a result. Modern universities and libraries have developed some protections: endowments, tenure, academic freedom, diverse funding streams. But these protections are not absolute, and institutions remain vulnerable to political pressure, budget cuts, changes in societal values. The Library of Alexandria's decline reminds us that even the greatest institutions can fall when support is withdrawn. Fourth, the library's history reveals the difficulty of comprehensive preservation. The Ptolemies aspired to collect all the world's knowledge, and they made remarkable progress toward that goal. But comprehensive preservation proved impossible. Resources were always limited compared to the totality of texts in existence. copying was selective, and selections reflected the priorities and biases of those making decisions. Moreover, what is valued changes over time. Texts that seemed important to 3rd century BCE scholars might seem less important to 1st century CE scholars, and might be irrelevant to 7th century CE scholars. The library could not preserve everything, so it preserved selectively, and the selections reflected contemporary judgments about what mattered. This meant that some texts survived multiple copying cycles because they remained in demand, while others were copied once or twice and then disappeared as the originals deteriorated. We have multiple copies of Homer and Plato from the ancient world, but single copies or no copies of countless other authors whose works were once read and valued. Modern libraries and archives face the same challenge. Digital information is being created at a rate that vastly exceeds our capacity to preserve it. Selections must be made about what to keep and what to let go. Those selections will determine what future generations know about our time, just as ancient selections determined what we know about theirs. Fifth, the library story highlights the role of technology in knowledge preservation. The shift from scroll to codex was a major technological transition that affected how texts were stored, accessed, and preserved. The library adapted to this transition, but the adaptation was incomplete and costly, and some texts were surely lost in the process. The digital transition we are experiencing is even more profound. Digital formats offer extraordinary advantages: searchability, compactness, ease of reproduction, and distribution. But they also introduce new fragilities: file format obsolescence, dependence on complex technologies, vulnerability to data corruption. The transition from analog to digital is still ongoing, and we do not yet know what will be lost in the process. The Library of Alexandria's experience suggests we should be humble about our ability to manage such transitions, should invest seriously in preservation during transition periods, should maintain redundancy and multiple formats to protect against unforeseen failures. Finally, the library teaches us about the fragility of cultural achievement. For centuries, the Library of Alexandria was the greatest library in the world, a monument to human learning, an institution that seemed permanent and invulnerable. Yet it declined and ultimately disappeared, its buildings gone, its collection dispersed or destroyed, its traditions interrupted. This fragility is a general feature of human civilization. Even our greatest achievements, our institutions, our monuments, our accumulated knowledge, are vulnerable to decay, destruction, and loss. Nothing lasts forever without constant effort to maintain and renew it. This is not cause for despair, but for diligent effort. The Library of Alexandria succeeded for over 700 years, a remarkable achievement. It transmitted knowledge across generations, enabled scholarship that advanced human understanding, preserved texts that enriched subsequent civilizations. That it eventually declined does not negate those achievements, and the library's legacy continues. The texts preserved in Alexandria, copied and recopied, transmitted through Byzantine and Islamic channels, eventually reached medieval Europe and contributed to the Renaissance revival of classical learning. The catalogue system developed in Alexandria influenced later library science. The model of a comprehensive research library inspired later institutions. The very idea that knowledge should be gathered, preserved, and made accessible owes much to the Alexandrian example. When we visit modern libraries, the Library of Congress, the British Library, the great university libraries, the digital repositories that preserve our contemporary knowledge, we are visiting descendants of the Library of Alexandria. The specific institution is gone, but its mission continues, carried forward by generations of librarians, scholars, and preservation specialists who understand that knowledge is precious and fragile, and worthy of the effort required to maintain it. The scholars we met in our journey, Demetrius observing the stars, Marcus cataloguing the collection, Theon managing scarce resources, Hypatia teaching in the face of growing intolerance, Philoponus negotiating with new rulers, Ahmad preserving what remained, represent the countless individuals whose labor sustained the library across its long history. They were not all famous, were not all brilliant, but they were all essential. Their daily work, their commitment to preservation, their belief in the value of knowledge kept the institution functioning. and that work continues today. In libraries and archives around the world, people are cataloguing collections, copying deteriorating documents, digitizing fragile texts, maintaining systems that make knowledge accessible. They are performing the same essential work that Alexandrian librarians performed, adapted to modern technologies and institutions, but fundamentally unchanged in its purpose. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but what it represented, the human commitment to gathering, preserving, and transmitting knowledge, persists. As long as people value learning, as long as societies commit resources to preservation, as long as institutions exist to maintain collections and provide access, the spirit of the Library of Alexandria lives on. We cannot recover what was lost in Alexandria. The burned scrolls, the texts that crumbled to dust, the knowledge that disappeared. These are gone forever, and we are poorer for their loss. But we can honour that loss by renewing the commitment to preservation, by supporting the institutions that maintain our own collections, by recognising that the work of librarians and archivists is essential to civilization. The Library of Alexandria failed, ultimately, but it also succeeded, for centuries, brilliantly. It preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. It enabled scholarship that advanced human understanding. It created a model of intellectual life that inspired later generations. Its story is not primarily a story of destruction, but of achievement, of the human capacity to create institutions that transcend individual lives, that gather and preserve the accumulated learning of civilizations. As we conclude our exploration, let us remember the library not as it ended, diminished, neglected, fading away, but as it was in its glory, a magnificent institution, a wonder of the ancient world, a treasury of knowledge staffed by dedicated scholars who understood that preserving the wisdom of the past and transmitting it to the future was among the most important work human beings could undertake. That understanding remains true today. Knowledge is still precious. Preservation is still necessary. The work continues, must continue, will continue, as long as civilization values learning and commits to maintaining the institutions, the resources, and the traditions that make the preservation and transmission of knowledge possible. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but its legacy endures, in the texts it preserved, in the model it created, in the inspiration it provides, and in the ongoing work of preservation that continues in its name across the world, connecting us to the past and preparing knowledge for transmission to the future, honoring the scholars who devoted their lives to learning, remembering the scrolls that contain the accumulated wisdom of ancient civilization, and learning from the slow demise that teaches us how fragile our own achievements are, and how essential it is to protect them through the constant, diligent, unglamorous work of preservation that every generation must undertake if knowledge is to survive.